Let's get right into it because there's a lot to unpack this week, and most of it connects back to one single storyline that nobody has fully put together yet. Reuters broke the news on July 29th that Iran is weeks away from receiving the first shipment of up to 400 Chinese-made shoulder-fired air defense missiles, known as MANPADS, Man-Portable Air Defense Systems, in a deal worth somewhere between $60 and $70 million. And I want to walk you through why this single procurement tells you almost everything about where this war is heading, what Iran can and cannot do to American aircraft, and why a stealth fighter, a water tower in Minnesota, and a burning gas tanker in Egypt are all part of the exact same strategy. Let's start with the deal itself, because the structure of it is almost more interesting than the missiles. According to Reuters reporting, sourced to people familiar with the matter, the contract for 300 to 400 MANPADS was not signed directly with a Chinese state arms exporter. It was signed with a company called Zhongqing Baosheng International Investment, a Hong Kong-registered intermediary sitting between Tehran and the actual Chinese supplier. That distinction matters enormously because just days before this story broke, Xi Jinping had personally told President Trump, in a direct conversation, that China would not, under any circumstances, sell or give weapons to Iran. Trump posted that assurance to Truth Social himself. So on paper, Beijing kept its word. The state didn't sign anything. A shell company did, and that is precisely the point. When you build a Hong Kong cutout between yourself and a supplier, and then you also develop a backup overland route so the shipment doesn't have to move by sea, you're not designing a deal you're prepared to defend in public. You are designing a deal you expect to deny. The reported delivery plan has the missiles flying out of Urumqi in western China, transiting through Pakistan, and then being moved into Iran, avoiding the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman entirely, where ship movements are easy to track by satellite and by customs records. China's foreign ministry has called the reporting completely groundless. Pakistan's military public affairs office has called the transit claim false. And President Trump, when asked about it from the Oval Office, said it would be surprising if true, which, if you know how he talks about Iran at this point, is about as close to an eye roll as you're going to get in an official transcript. He knows the IRGC is going to keep trying to drag this fight out any way it can. That's exactly why the last 2 weeks have seen absolutely relentless American strikes on Revolutionary Guard infrastructure, headquarters, safe houses, small boats, anything that keeps this proxy machine running. Now here's the part that should actually worry people, and it's the part most coverage has buried. The missiles in question are the Chinese-made QW-12 and the FN-16. Both are infrared-guided, shoulder-fired, man-portable systems, broadly comparable in performance to something like the Russian Igla family. We're talking about an engagement envelope out to a few kilometers, a high-explosive fragmentation warhead, impact and laser proximity fusing, and a top speed somewhere between Mach 1 and Mach 2. These are not standoff weapons. They are ambush weapons. The entire doctrine behind a MANPADS is surprise. You don't paint the target with radar. You don't emit anything a radar warning receiver can pick up. You hide, you wait, and you fire at the last possible second from a position the pilot never saw. Historically, these systems have been most lethal against helicopters and slow, low-flying aircraft, which is exactly why Iran wants as many of them as it can disperse across the country right now. If you can't rebuild a real integrated air defense network, and Iran genuinely cannot at this point, you fall back on volume. You put binocular-carrying spotters with shoulder launchers on every hilltop, every ridgeline, every overpass near a strategic site, and you make low-altitude flying expensive and uncertain for anyone flying over you. To understand why Iran has been pushed into this corner, you have to look at what's happened to its actual air defense architecture over the last several months. Iran fought to hold the sky with fixed, radar-guided systems, the S-300 batteries, the domestically built Bavar 373, all the larger surface-to-air missile infrastructure it had built up over 2 decades. And American and Israeli suppression campaigns have taken that entire network apart, piece by piece, because a radar has to emit to see anything, and a fixed site has to sit still to be targeted. Once you know where the emitters are, you can either destroy them directly or force them silent, and either way the airspace opens up. Iran's Navy has taken similar punishment. Its larger air defense radars are largely gone. So what's left for a country that still wants to keep fighting without a functioning integrated air defense system? Passive, dispersed, disposable weapons that don't need a radar, don't need a fixed emplacement, and don't need to protect anything more valuable than the individual holding it. That's the entire logic behind 400 MANPADS. It's not a replacement for what Iran lost. It's an admission that Iran can't rebuild what it lost, so it's pivoting to something cheaper and harder to eliminate entirely. And this brings us to the incident that, in a lot of ways, set this whole procurement in motion. On March 19, 2026, an Air Force F-35A Lightning II was flying a combat mission over Iran as part of Operation Epic Fury when it took a hit from ground fire. Capture Tim Hawkins, the CENTCOM spokesperson, confirmed to reporters that the aircraft was flying a combat mission over Iran when it was struck, and that it landed safely at a base in the region with the pilot in stable condition, with the incident placed under investigation. The IRGC put out its own statement and video the same day, claiming it had successfully struck and severely damaged the jet, framing it as proof that Iran's air defenses had adapted and improved. Whether it was a true man-portable system or some other passive infrared weapon has never been publicly confirmed by the American side, but the details line up. There was no radar warning. Analysts who cover this closely have pointed to the total absence of any radar warning receiver indication as the tell here, because if you were hit by an actual radar-guided surface-to-air missile, the jet's systems would have flagged it well before impact. No warning means whatever hit that F-35 wasn't emitting anything to detect, which is exactly the signature you'd expect from an electro-optical, infrared-guided, man-portable missile fired from a hidden position, potentially from elevated terrain that gave the shooter extra altitude advantage before the jet even had a chance to react. What actually matters here isn't just that the jet took a hit, it's that the jet came home. And that's worth spending some real time on, because the F-35's survivability isn't an accident. It's the product of a specific set of design requirements written specifically to fight this exact kind of threat environment. The Joint Strike Fighter program was built around penetrating integrated air defense networks running on Russian and Chinese radar architecture, because that's the family of systems adversaries like Iran, North Korea, and others have spent decades buying and fielding. Every major survivability system on that airframe traces its lineage back to fighting exactly this kind of threat picture. Start with the AN/AQ-37 distributed aperture system. This is a network of 6 infrared sensors mounted around the airframe that together give the pilot full spherical situational awareness with no blind spots and no manual aiming required. It automatically detects a missile launch, tracks the missile in flight, calculates the launch point, and cues countermeasures without the pilot lifting a finger. It's been demonstrated tracking ballistic missile launches from hundreds of miles away, and it projects that picture directly onto the pilot's helmet display, so the pilot can effectively look straight down through the floor of the aircraft and see the threat coming. Layer on top of that, the AN/ASQ-239 Barracuda electronic warfare suite from BAE Systems, which gives the jet 360 degrees of radar warning and jamming capability built to function in a dense, contested signal environment. And then there's the AN/ALQ-70 towed decoy, a device that can be streamed out behind the aircraft specifically to pull an incoming missile's seeker away from the actual airframe. Add in the Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine, which took punishment in this incident, and still generated enough thrust and reliability to get that pilot back to a runway, and you start to understand why this jet survived something that, on paper, should have been catastrophic. But here's the honest caveat, and it's the same one serious defense analysts have raised. The ASQ-239 electronic warfare suite is an extraordinary piece of engineering, but its entire design is built around detecting and characterizing radar emissions. A passive, infrared-guided, man-portable missile emits nothing. There's no signal for that suite to intercept, no warning tone to give the pilot advance notice. That's precisely why Iran is pursuing this path, instead of trying to rebuild a radar network it simply cannot afford or protect anymore. They want a weapon that slips past the exact sensor suite that's been shredding their conventional air defenses. It's a reasonable adaptation on their part, and it's exactly the kind of threat evolution the F-35's open architecture is built to respond to over time through updated sensor fusion, new countermeasure profiles, and evolving tactics, techniques, and procedures for low-altitude operations in threat environments like this one. So put yourself in Iran's position for a second. You cannot find an F-35 with radar because it wasn't built to be found that way, and you don't have the advanced infrared search and track systems that might give you a fighting chance at longer range. What you can do, relatively cheaply, is put a man with a tube and a shoulder launcher on high ground near strategic sites, and hope that low-altitude strafing runs or reconnaissance flights bring an aircraft close enough, low enough, for a few seconds of exposure. That's genuinely what this deal is. It's not a new integrated system. It's hundreds of individual ambush positions distributed across the country, each one representing a small chance of a hit, multiplied by hundreds of opportunities. If you do the math on the reported deal value against the number of systems, you're looking at something like $150,000 to $230,000 per launcher, once you account for missile rounds, optics, training gear, spare parts, and transport containers. If Iran organizes these into small 4-launcher detachments, that's potentially 75 to 100 separate firing positions spread around the country, each one representing a threat that has to be assumed present even when it probably isn't, which is its own kind of psychological weapon. Now, let's talk about footage that's been circulating, because there's a specific clip worth addressing directly. There's video making the rounds of what appears to be an American Super Hornet conducting a low-altitude strafing run over southern Iran, with an explosion visible behind the aircraft as it pulls away. Whether that was a towed decoy doing its job, or a missile detonating on a flare, or something else entirely, hasn't been independently confirmed, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What is clear is that time of flight on one of these shoulder-fired systems from launch to impact is somewhere in the range of 4 to 8 seconds. That's an incredibly short window. It's why any aircraft doing low-altitude work over contested terrain has to be running every countermeasure system available simultaneously. Chaff, flares, towed decoys, jamming, because there simply isn't time to react to a visual launch indication and then separately deploy defenses. The whole survivability picture has to already be running before the missile is even in the air. Before we move away from the aircraft itself, it's worth putting the epic fury loss numbers in some context, because the F-35 incident hasn't happened in isolation. By late March, the F-35 was already one of roughly 20 American aircraft known to be damaged or destroyed since the operation began in late February. And notably, most of that attrition hasn't come from Iranian air defenses at all. 3 F-15E Strike Eagles were lost earlier in March to a friendly fire incident involving a Kuwaiti fighter, with all crew members recovered safely, and a KC-135 Stratotanker went down in western Iraq in a crash that killed all 6 airmen aboard. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you something important about the actual balance of risk in this campaign. A high-tempo, multi-week air war generates its own attrition through fatigue, congestion, and operational complexity, independent of anything the adversary does. Iran managing to land even a single confirmed hit on a 5th-generation stealth aircraft against that backdrop is genuinely notable, even if the aircraft survived, and even if the hit came from a relatively unsophisticated passive weapon, rather than anything resembling a modern integrated air defense system. It's a symbolic win dressed up as a tactical one, and Tehran has treated it accordingly, with Iranian state media framing the incident as proof that its air defenses are evolving and adapting, even as its conventional systems get dismantled. It's also worth noting that Iran has had some success against other aircraft during this stretch of the war, just not American ones. Earlier in March, an Israeli F-35I Adir, the specialized Israeli variant equipped with its own indigenous electronic warfare suite, scored what's being described as the first confirmed air-to-air kill of a manned fighter in the conflict, downing an Iranian Yak-130 light combat aircraft. British F-35B Lightnings flying out of regional Royal Air Force bases have also been conducting defensive sorties near Iranian airspace, including intercepting and downing multiple Iranian drones over Jordan. So the F-35 program, as a whole, across 3 different operators flying 3 different variants, has actually been performing about as advertised throughout this conflict. The March 19th incident is the outlier, not the pattern, but it's the outlier that Iran desperately needed because it's the one piece of evidence Tehran can point to and say their adaptation strategy is working. Let's shift now to something that's been happening entirely outside the skies over Iran, because it's part of the exact same pattern. Starting Sunday night and continuing into Monday, more than 30 community water systems across Minnesota were hit by a coordinated cyber attack. The intrusion came through internet-connected programmable logic controllers, the devices that remotely monitor and manage pumps, valves, and treatment processes at water utilities. According to Minnesota IT services and state officials, the attackers altered settings and locked operators out of remote access, forcing several municipalities to switch to manual operation. In at least one town, workers had to physically go out to a pump house and operate systems by hand because the attackers had effectively turned off automated well controls. No drinking water was confirmed compromised, and officials have been clear about that, but the disruption itself was real, and it happened across at least 7 states, according to federal reporting, not just Minnesota. The FBI and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency have been investigating whether Iranian-linked actors, specifically a group security researchers have associated with previous Iran-linked infrastructure intrusions, were behind this, while cautioning that attribution work is still preliminary and that other actors could be deliberately mimicking Iranian tactics to stir up the conflict without actually being Iranian themselves. CISA had already updated an advisory about this exact kind of activity days before the Minnesota incident became public, warning that threat actors were targeting programmable logic controllers across water, wastewater, and energy infrastructure sectors. This isn't a new playbook either. Security researchers have tied the operational pattern in Minnesota to a group known as Cyberattacks, an Iran-linked outfit that presents itself publicly as an independent hacktivist collective, but is broadly assessed to have ties back to the Revolutionary Guard's cyber apparatus. This same group has been ramping up activity against American critical infrastructure since earlier in the year, initially focusing on Rockwell Automation and Allen Bradley industrial control equipment before CISA's most recent advisory expanded the warning to include Schneider Electric and Siemens systems as well. The core vulnerability being exploited here isn't some sophisticated zero-day exploit. It's depressingly simple. Small municipal water utilities running programmable logic controllers that are directly reachable over the public internet, often through cellular connections installed by system integrators years ago for convenience, with weak or default credentials that were never rotated. Small and rural water systems are, by a wide margin, some of the least defended pieces of critical infrastructure in the country, because they typically don't have dedicated cybersecurity staff, dedicated budgets, or even basic network segmentation between their business systems and their operational technology. That combination of low cost of entry and high potential for public panic is exactly why this keeps happening, and exactly why CISA, the FBI, and the EPA have all been scrambling over the past week to help utilities get vulnerable equipment off the open internet before the next round of intrusions. Think about what that actually is for a second. No missile, no aircraft, no radar signature, no launch to intercept. Just a password change on a piece of remote industrial equipment sitting on the public internet in a small town that almost certainly never expected to be a front line in a geopolitical conflict. That is the same underlying logic as the MANPADS deal, just executed in a completely different domain. You don't need to win a symmetrical fight if you can make the other side's day-to-day operations expensive, uncertain, and exhausting through 1,000 small, deniable, hard-to-attribute actions. And then there's what happened in Egypt, which ties this whole picture together even more tightly. Just before the Damietta incident, Ukraine struck an Iranian-owned cargo vessel, the Anna, in the Caspian Sea near Russia's Astrakhan port, reportedly killing one sailor and wounding several others. Iranian officials condemned that strike and vowed it would not go unanswered. Iranian state media then specifically named the Egyptian port of Damietta as a potential target for retaliation, describing it as a gateway for gas exports to Europe. 2 days later, on July 29th, at least one drone, and according to some maritime security sources, possibly two, struck the Energos Winter, a floating storage and regasification unit owned by the American company Energos Infrastructure, docked at Damietta. Fire spread to a second vessel moored alongside it, the Greek-owned tanker Gaslog Salem. Both crews were evacuated safely. No injuries were reported. And Egypt's cabinet confirmed a day later that preliminary investigations determined the fire was caused by a drone. No group has formally claimed responsibility. And some regional analysts have pointed out that Damietta primarily handles gas imports for Egypt's own domestic market, rather than exports to Europe or Israel, which would make the strategic value of the target more symbolic than material. But symbolism is often the entire point of these actions. This marked the first attack to land on Egyptian soil since the war between the United States and Iran began back in February. And it demonstrates something Iran clearly once demonstrated, that its reach now extends well beyond its own borders in the immediate Gulf region into the broader Mediterranean energy infrastructure that Europe increasingly depends on. So here's the actual pattern once you step back and look at all three of these stories together: the MANPADS deal, the Minnesota water systems, and the Damietta drone strike. For months, Iran tried to contest the sky directly with a real integrated air defense network built around fixed radar sites and larger surface-to-air missile batteries. That fight is essentially over, and Iran lost it decisively. American and Israeli suppression campaigns took that entire architecture apart because a radar has to emit to function, and a fixed site has to sit still to be defended. And once you know where something is and it can't move, it's only a matter of time before it's gone. So Iran has pivoted completely. What it's building now is functionally the opposite of everything it had before. It's passive instead of active. It's dispersed instead of concentrated. It's disposable instead of high value. And critically, there's very little for American planners to actually aim at in advance, because the whole point of a man with a shoulder launcher hiding on a hillside, or a hacker changing a password on a rural water utility's remote access panel, or a single drone launched against an anchored gas tanker is that none of it looks like a target until after it's already been used. This is where I think the more interesting strategic read comes in, because what Iran is doing here isn't really about defeating American military power directly. Nobody in Tehran believes 400 shoulder-fired missiles are going to reverse the outcome of this war or push American aircraft out of Iranian airspace entirely. What this is actually about is making American power expensive and uncertain to use, forcing pilots, planners, and policymakers to constantly account for a threat that's difficult to locate in advance and difficult to fully eliminate once it's already been dispersed across the country. It's a war of friction rather than a war of decisive engagements. And there's an interesting parallel here to classic insurgency doctrine. Except in this case, Iran isn't fighting a foreign insurgency. It's essentially building one out of its own security apparatus. The Revolutionary Guard is creating a distributed, hard-to-root-out presence specifically designed to survive and continue operating even after its conventional military capacity has been dismantled. It's the same basic logic you'd see in any insurgent movement that's lost the ability to fight symmetrically and has shifted to asymmetric, dispersed, hard-to-target tactics instead. And if you follow that logic all the way through, there's actually a mirror image argument worth thinking about, which is that dispersed, hard-to-target resistance cuts both ways. The same principle that makes 400 scattered MANPADS hard for the United States to preemptively neutralize is the same principle that would make widely distributed small arms difficult for the IRGC to fully suppress if they ended up in the hands of ordinary Iranians who've spent years living under that regime's enforcement apparatus. If the IRGC has to wonder whether showing up to intimidate a neighborhood in the middle of the night carries real personal risk, that changes their calculus in exactly the same way. American pilots now have to factor in the possibility of a hidden shoulder launcher on a ridgeline they're flying over. Dispersed, unpredictable resistance is a genuinely powerful strategic tool, and it's not exclusive to whoever happens to be using it first. Let's also talk briefly about the broader diplomatic backdrop, because it helps explain why Iran feels like it needs a new card to play right now. Around the same time all of this was unfolding, President Trump announced on Truth Social that what he called the Board of Peace had reached what he described as a historic agreement for the complete disarmament of Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza, calling it a major step toward lasting regional peace and security. Whatever the final implementation looks like, and details of enforcement mechanisms are still being worked out, the optics for Tehran are not good. Hamas has functioned as one of Iran's principal regional proxies for decades, part of the broader network of aligned armed groups Iran has cultivated specifically so it doesn't have to fight its adversaries directly. Watching one of your most prominent proxy relationships move toward formal disarmament, even partially, is exactly the kind of development that pushes a government already looking for ways to demonstrate continued relevance toward more aggressive, more visible action elsewhere, whether that's a drone strike on a gas tanker in Egypt, a wave of cyber intrusions against water infrastructure in the American Midwest, or accelerating a MANPADS deal that's been reportedly in the works for a while but suddenly needs to move faster. I also want to address the timeline questions directly because a Reuters report citing sources familiar with the matter always deserves some healthy skepticism until more evidence surfaces. Reuters itself noted in its reporting that while the contract has reportedly been signed, delivery schedules, exact quantities, and other implementation details could still change before that first shipment actually arrives. Beijing's denial has been categorical, and Pakistan's has been just as firm. It's entirely possible parts of this reporting evolve or get revised as more sourcing comes in over the coming weeks. But the underlying behavioral pattern here, a Hong Kong intermediary, a Chinese Communist Party-linked supplier chain, a Central Asian air corridor through Urumqi and Pakistan, specifically chosen to avoid the heavily monitored maritime routes through the Gulf, fits a broader trend that's been documented for years now. Since 2023, the United States has sanctioned numerous Chinese and Hong Kong-based firms accused of funneling dual-use electronics, carbon fiber, machine tools, missile production equipment, drone components, and financial services to Iran, all while Beijing's official position has remained one of studied distance from any direct involvement. This deal, if it plays out as reported, would simply be the latest and one of the largest known examples of that same shadow procurement architecture in action. So where does this actually leave things going forward? If the shipment does arrive within the reported time frame, expect to see a much more visible push from American and allied forces, specifically targeting suspected MANPAD storage and staging sites before those systems get fully dispersed and hidden across the country, because the entire strategic value of these weapons collapses if they can be found and destroyed in bulk, before they're spread out into hundreds of individual firing positions. Expect continued adaptation on the F-35 side as well, because that platform's entire design philosophy has always been built around iterative sensor fusion updates and evolving countermeasure profiles, specifically to stay ahead of exactly this kind of passive infrared threat. And expect the cyber and maritime drone dimensions of this conflict to keep expanding rather than contracting, because both of those domains offer Iran deniability that a conventional missile strike simply doesn't, and deniability has become the single most valuable currency Tehran has left in this fight. The bigger picture here is that Iran has essentially conceded the high-altitude, high-value, radar-guided fight. What's left is an attempt to make every altitude below that, every water utility, every anchored tanker, every port facility, feel like a potential threat surface, all without ever having to openly admit responsibility for any single incident. That's a strategy built for a country that knows it can't win outright anymore, but still believes it can make winning cost more than the other side wants to pay. Whether that calculation actually holds over the coming months is genuinely an open question, and it's one worth watching closely because the answer is going to shape how this entire conflict resolves. What do you all think about this? Does a strategy built entirely around dispersed, deniable, hard-to-target actions actually work against a military with the kind of censor and strike capability the United States has demonstrated throughout this conflict? Or is Iran just buying itself time and inflicting cost without any realistic path to actually changing the outcome? Let me know your take in the comments. I read every single one. And thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.